In the wake of Facebook's temporary shutdown, for reasons too techno-babbly for my Dumbo brain to understand, causing the company's stocks to plummet, Zuckerberg's personal wealth to tank, and maybe, just maybe more importantly, the communication methods for regular people across the entire globe suddenly shutting down, leaving them unable to connect with their loved ones. An event so weirdly cataclysmic in its scope, it immediately, within a few short hours, made a very concise case for the question, hey, maybe these companies are getting a little too big, maybe their monopolistic practices can have considerable harm outside of just market competition. Oh, but don't stress, folks. Don't you worry your pretty little head. The supposedly opposition liberal media, not only are they out to try to dispel discussions about keeping the power of these giant megacorps in check, but now some of them, like Ben Schott, this op-ed writer for Bloomberg Opinion, are arguing that we should be giving these companies even more power by recognizing them with a seat at the table of the United Nations. So yeah, for today's video, I just wanted to take a quick look at this opinion article from Bloomberg, because while really well written, I think it provides a very important lens into the inability of some people, institutions, or ideologies to resist our slow decline back toward like feudalism, or I guess more specifically for an American context, the late 19th century monopoly economy that we had. You know, the thing that unionists died to try to get us away from. We're just kind of slowly falling back toward that, and the media that's supposedly here to protect us from the powerful at times seems unable or unwilling to argue that anything other than our current reality is how we should be going about things. I'm not going to read the whole article. I do recommend you go read it yourself because I do think it's actually well written. There's a lot of interesting little tidbits in there and a lot of sources and facts that he draws from. And despite what the title suggests, this is not like a full-throated defense of corporations being as monopolistic as they are. Like, he is throughout the article pretty critical of their monopolistic practices, which is part of the issue that I'll get into later, but I'll put a link down below if you want to go read this yourself. You can also, I guess, just Google the title. It's easy to find things these days, lucky us. However, I do want to read a few specific sections for you to give you a sense, if you don't have the time to go read, what this article is kind of arguing about. So let's get to it. Walmart employs roughly the population of Botswana. Microsoft's market cap is greater than Brazil's GDP, which, by the way, all three of those tidbits, absolute hell world shit. There's no greater sign that deregulating the means of keeping monopolies in check leads to monopolies than when one company employs the population of an entire country, and when single corporations have a higher market cap than entire countries. Like, that's just kind of scary. For much of the article, he's using very specific terms and comparisons to argue the nuanced ways in which these companies do kind of function like nation states. The way that, you know, board of directors kind of resemble legislators and stuff like that. And in this section, just to give context, he's trying to argue how the way companies were involved in the response to the Rona topped that of a lot of nation states. So let's read. External defense and internal assistance have historically been the province, the raison d'etre. Somebody who's French, please roast me in the comments section for that one. Earthquakes, outbreaks, hurricanes, heat waves, floods, fires, insurrections, and invasions demand a scale of command and control typically available only to state, military, and civil agencies. The Rona tested this truism, even in the most advanced nations, both because of the pandemic's unprecedented global impact and because the highly specialized responses it required could often only be provided expeditiously by brands. More novel was how nation-states turned to private companies to solve the unprecedented challenge of contact tracing entire populations. In May of 2020, Apple and Google set aside their rivalry to launch an exposure notification API, available to official public health bodies via iOS and Android. By September, more than 40 countries and 25 US states had plugged into this API. Such embedded reliance helped explain why this fella's trust barometer indicated that CEOs were more trusted than government leaders, religious leaders, and journalists. Business was more trusted than government in 18 of 27 countries, and 68% thought CEOs should step in when the government fails to fix societal problems. In this next section, as the title might imply, he's talking about the ways in which a lot of modern companies make their money from moving really quickly before the regulation catches up to them. Although the ability to enact and enforce legislation is a defining characteristic of the nation-state, private companies have long been powerful enough to shape public laws to their liking behind closed doors. Notice how he just kind of neutrally says that? He doesn't really quite call into question that that's a bad thing. He just kind of states it as a reality of being, which we'll get into later. That's kind of the motif of this whole essay. Of course, brands wield their greatest legal power at the early stage of innovation, before relevant rules and regulations are even envisioned. Envisaged? That's not a word I think I've ever seen before. Many of our buzziest brands have blitzscaled to vast market caps by leapfrogging their industry's rules and regulations and embedding themselves into society's fabric before politicians have even uncapped their pens. As we see from legal challenges across the globe, the most brazen examples are to be found in the sphere of peer-to-peer platforms, where accommodation companies sidestep the taxes paid by estate agents, renters and hotelers, and ride-sharing brands circumvent the norms of employment and qualifications. Which is absolutely true. The gig economy, in a lot of meaningful ways, is sending us decades upon decades back in terms of the labor movement. Conversations that we'd settled generations ago about what it means to be an employee and about what kind of things an employer owes. We've done away with all the progress and all the victories that the working class achieved said generations ago, and we're careening towards square one. Multinationals have eagerly exploited global caps and mismatches in nation-state tax codes to pay low or no corporate tax. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, such base erosion and profit shifting strategies cost nation-states between $100 and $240 billion a year in lost revenue. In other words, 4 to 10% of the global corporate income tax totals. A number which also becomes super relevant in the wake of the Pandora Papers coming out. In this next section, he's talking mainly about space exploration and how quickly that went from development via central control of nations to private corporations. Fast forward another 50 years, and private brands may well be planting extraterrestrial territorial logos alongside the flags of nation-states. Elon Musk is already there. The terms and conditions of his satellite internet service, Starlink, boldly state, for services provided on Mars or in transit to Mars via Starship or other colonization spacecraft, these parties recognize Mars as a free planet and that no Earth-based government has authority or sovereignty over Martian activities. Disputes will be settled through self-governing principles established in good faith. Good faith, yeah, sure, Jan. So get ready for Elon Musk company towns where you get paid in Tesla bucks and can only buy from Tesla stores. And lastly, we have the final conclusion for this whole opinion piece. He introed the section talking about South Sudan entering the UN. So here he says, this isn't to say South Sudan shouldn't be the UN's 193rd member, but why not make Amazon the 194th? Despite the UN Secretary General's rabble-rousing condemnation of billionaires joyriding to space while millions go hungry on Earth, he would doubtless jump at a meeting with Jeff Bezos with at least the same electricity as he'd sit down with South Sudan's president. If brands have the power, wealth, and impact of nation-states, and increasingly act like nation-states, should they not be brought into the nation-state community and held to account for what they really are? Equals, allies, competitors, and threats? So before I really lay into this guy, I want to give credit to what I'm assuming would be his main defense against accusations that he's super cheering on pro-business. One of the things he stresses in the little blurb before the title, and he stresses here, is about holding them to account. The idea, I'm sure, for him is that once Facebook is a UN member, they can be regulated, or maybe there could be motions against them to try to force these companies into things that better the world in ways that individual nation states don't quite have the power to. So to give credit to the guy, somebody who I don't think is a grifter, even if he might be, doing the work of businesses here, he probably does think this move would ultimately help keep these mega corporations in check. But I'm not so much interested in teasing that apart today, teasing apart if that is the route we should take to try to hold these companies accountable. What I really want to focus on is how, in an article written somewhat critically of these corporations, like, he does feel like a moderate to liberal type guy. Conservatives are much more known to outright full-throat defend corporations and their pursuit of profits no matter the cost. One thing he distinctly does not do in this article, as critical as he is of corporations, is try to argue that we should try to get out of this mess. Like, he brings up a lot of concerning points. Again, Walmart employs the population of Botswana. Microsoft's market cap is greater than Brazil's GDP. He brings up the ways that governments struggled to respond to COVID without the help of private corporations. He brings up the activism companies have taken in recent years to specific laws. He spends all this time talking about how concerningly powerful these mega corporations are getting and how they are starting to take the shape of a sort of primordial nation state. But he never stops to argue that we need to halt this forward progression. He never once suggests doing something to change that fundamental condition. Rather, he just says we need to embrace this reality. And let's really go point by point on this. Microsoft's market cap is greater than Brazil's GDP. Maybe instead of giving Microsoft the relative power of a nation state, maybe, just maybe, we should break it up. The reason it has a greater market cap than Brazil's GDP is because it's got its fingers in all sorts of little pots. Like, that's the problem. Like, to talk about a different company for a second, Disney, for example, which is starting to get very concerningly close to monopolizing media. The solution isn't to say, okay, Disney, we'll give you a seat at the UN, you can choose who to sanction or not. The thing to say is, maybe Disney shouldn't be allowed to buy up every company's IP until they own the majority of intellectual properties. Maybe, if we look at the struggles of nation states during the Rona period and see that they're struggling to respond to public health events, maybe our takeaway there should be, hey, let's re-emphasize public health. And what that means differs depending on the country, but that's not a thing he in this article considers. He just says, well, these companies are getting pretty important. I guess we'd better recognize them like they are countries. He shared these stats about how people trust business people more than government leaders, but he doesn't take the time to argue that that's a result of a decades-long conservative project to argue that governance is bad and that we need to just turn our lives over to business people. Rather, he just kind of takes it as a reality, a fact of life that people trust businesses more than government leaders, so I guess we need to give them the power of government leaders. I could keep going on with more examples, and trust me, there's plenty of moments like that throughout this article. But I wanted to share this with you folks today because I can't think of a stronger example of just outright capitalist realism than this opinion piece. Our slow decline toward companies completely ruling over our lives, toward companies subverting not only regulation in terms of safety for their workers or how they're supposed to treat their workers, but also taxes. We have this author with a pretty good understanding of the multitudinous ways that this stuff kind of sucks, and his only response is to say, well, let's take it one step further. So many people are incapable of imagining anything other than the hell world that we live in, that our solutions to our current problems are just more of the same. there is shockingly little push towards a new kind of reality, toward keeping these companies in check in the way of breaking up the monopolies or more strictly regulating labor. Rather, on the whole, we either get stupid, unnecessary regulations, like the other day they were talking in Congress about trying to limit the number of accounts people can have, Finstas and all that, because maybe, just maybe, that would keep people off the platform slightly less. A change that would do nothing to harm the business model of those companies, but makes it look like we're doing something. We either have that end of the spectrum, or we have this end of the spectrum, arguing that we should give private companies a power while they've in secret essentially had for years, just outright give them the sway of a nation state. And even though this article was written before Facebook shut down, I brought it up at the top because to me it illuminates how necessary it is for us to have conversations about the problems with this model and the ways to get away from it, not just embrace it. Like, I 10,000% have my issues with AOC. I think she struggles to use her leverage properly in a lot of instances, and I mean a lot of instances. But I give her credit, and I'm excited to see what her and her like-minded peers might do with this. She immediately seized upon the Facebook opportunity to argue for breaking them up. Instagram, WhatsApp, and a variety of other companies that Facebook bought up, competitors that they're like, we're worried about you, we're going to control you now. If those acquisitions had never been allowed to happen, Facebook's crash would have been harmful, certainly because it's a big company on its own, but it would have been markedly less damaging if we at some point down the line hadn't allowed these mega monopolies to form. So I really do think this Facebook shutdown is a moment to try to make actual change happen, not just waving the white flag to these mega corporations and say, fine, you want to act like a country, have the power of a country. We can take this opportunity to really pressure for fundamental change in the other direction. And I guess we'll see in the coming weeks if and how that happens. But anyways, that's all I have for today. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. Now let's turn it on over to the pre-recorded outro. Be sure to toss me a like and subscribe down below. But if you really want to help me out, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, like early versions of every video, and exclusive Patreon-only videos. Plus, if you join the Piley Benton's Biggest Boys tier, you get your name read off at the end of every video, which I am about to do once I pull up the names. Zoth, Revo Pregame, Emily, Kyle Foley, Jennifer Jones, Caffeine Unicorn, Goblin of the Year, Stockwell Homestead, Nillick Elites, Floof Pants, and Cameron Fordo. So if you want to hear your lovely name read off at the end of every video, be sure to join me on this specific tier. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.